Welcome to human glory. The tea had gone cold between them. Neither of them mentioned it. It sat in a white porcelain cup on the table by the window, thin steam long gone, a pale skin gathering across the top in the late afternoon light. Outside, the city kept moving in its usual way. Traffic below. Distant sirens. A vendor shouting somewhere on the corner. A world continuing with complete confidence in its own importance, unaware that in a small apartment 6 floors above the street, 2 brothers had run out of easy things to say. Aaron sat with both hands around the cup, though he had not lifted it once. He wore plain clothes, dark trousers, a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the wrist. No medals. No insignia. No rank displayed anywhere. It made no difference. He looked military in the way a blade looks sharp even in shadow. Not because of the uniform. Because of the shape that remained after the uniform was gone. Across from him, Alien had papers spread over half the table. Notes in 3 languages. Margin marks so dense they looked like a second text running beneath the first. He was still writing, though he had been writing for the better part of an hour, one page sliding over the next with the restless precision of a man who believed that if he could just find the exact phrasing, the exact structure, the exact door in the wall of another people's thinking, then violence might still be made unnecessary. The apartment smelled faintly of over-toasted bread. Neither of them had eaten that either. "They'll listen," Alien said. He did not look up when he said it. He said it in the worn flat voice of a man who had repeated the sentence often enough that the sound of it had lost brightness, but not weight. Whatever freshness the hope had once carried was gone. What remained was older than optimism and harder to kill. Aaron looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. Alien's pen stopped moving. The room went quiet in the small exact way rooms do when a truth has been placed on the table and no one is yet ready to touch it. Then Alien leaned back in his chair and finally looked up. In another life, in another room with different lighting and less history in their faces, strangers might have mistaken them for each other. The same dark eyes. The same stillness around the mouth. The same habit of looking at a thing directly, without ornament, without the social softening most people used to make looking easier to survive. But the resemblance ended where the choices began. Alien looked like someone who had spent his life trying to understand the machinery inside other people. Aaron looked like someone who had spent his life deciding exactly how much force it took to stop a machine once understanding had failed. "They will," Alien said again, more quietly this time. "If I can get them to hear the proposal in their own structure, in their own language, they'll have to." Aaron picked up the cold tea at last and drank from it without expression. Years of field stations, transport docks, command rooms, and sleepless campaign nights had filed away his ability to care about temperature. His body categorized things differently now. Useful. Not useful. Relevant. Not relevant. Warmth belonged to a softer filing system than the one he used to get through his days. "They don't have to do anything," he said. Alien gave a short tired smile at that, not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of sentence Aaron only ever spoke when he was trying, in his own severe and unspectacular way, to protect someone. On the table between the papers was a translation node no larger than a coin. Beside it, a printed route schedule. Beside that, the formal invitation from the Dominion Council, heavy cream paper, embossed seal, language polished to the point of emptiness. The invitation had arrived 3 days ago. Alien had read it once, then twice, then set it down parallel to the table edge as though neatness could force honesty into it. "You could tell me not to go," Alien said. Aaron set the cup down. Perfectly parallel to the saucer. Perfectly aligned with the grain of the wood. "No," he said. Alien waited. Aaron's eyes shifted to the papers, then to the little translation node, then finally back to his brother's face. "I could," he said. "You'd go anyway." The smallest change passed over Alien's expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Acknowledgement of being known completely, and of the fact that complete knowledge was, depending on the day, either love or surrender. Outside, a horn blared in the street below and was gone. Inside, the apartment held itself still around them. Alien gathered one stack of papers and tapped them into order. "If this works," he said, "it changes everything." Aaron looked at him. "If it doesn't," he said, "it changes everything." Alien did not answer. The tea stayed cold between them. The light in the window thinned by degrees. Somewhere in the kitchen, the untouched toast hardened on its plate. And in the long quiet that followed, the city continued moving below as though nothing in the universe had yet begun. It had. Alien left at 0610 the next morning. The train platform was nearly empty, the hour too early for commuters and too late for the kinds of people who had nowhere stable to go. The station lights cast everything in a pale, sleepless color. The floor looked clean from a distance and tired up close. Announcements moved through the air in a voice so neutral it seemed designed to reassure no one in particular. Aaron stood with him near the edge of the platform, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding the travel case that contained nothing fragile and everything important. Documents. Translation drafts. A backup node. A second backup node. Printed notes clipped into 3 separate sections. Elian had packed like a diplomat. Aaron had repacked the bag at 0430 like a man preparing someone to walk into a room he did not trust. Neither of them had slept much. This too went unmentioned. Elian took the case when Aaron handed it over. Their fingers touched briefly on the handle. It was the kind of contact that would have meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to someone who knew them well enough to notice how rarely either brother touched people without purpose. "Your return window is 6 days, Aaron said. Elian gave him a look. "I know my return window. I know you know." The announcement chime sounded again. A soft 3-note sequence that would years later lodge itself in Aaron's memory with an accuracy that made no practical sense. There are always details grief keeps for reasons logic cannot explain. Elian adjusted the strap over his shoulder. "You're doing the thing." Aaron looked at him. "What thing?" "The part where you say practical things because you don't want to say the other thing." Aaron was quiet for a moment. The train lights appeared far down the track, 2 white points moving steadily through the dark. "I'm saying the practical things," he said, "because the practical things are the things that keep people alive." Elian's mouth moved at one corner, not quite a smile. "And the other thing?" Aaron looked past him at the tracks, at the clean steel lines vanishing into the tunnel like a decision already made. "The other thing," he said, "doesn't improve the odds." That was the shape of him. Elian had known it his whole life. When they were boys, other children had mistaken Aaron for unkind because he did not soften his warnings. Then they mistook him for cold because he did not perform comfort the way other people did, all warmth and visible concern and open-handed reassurance. Elian had learned earlier than most that Aaron was neither unkind nor cold. He was simply built in such a way that love passed through him and came out as structure, as preparation, as precision, as making sure the windows latched and the routes made sense and the numbers added up and the person leaving the house had a better chance of returning to it. When their mother died, Elian had sat on the kitchen floor and cried until he thought the body could not possibly hold that much grief without splitting. Aaron, who was 19 and already shaped too much like the man he would become, had made tea for the people who came to the apartment, found the insurance papers, called the hospital twice because one line in the report didn't make sense, and stood outside Elian's bedroom door at 3 in the morning with a blanket folded over one arm because he knew Elian would forget the night had turned cold. He had knocked once, waited, then opened the door without waiting for permission because grief was no time to pretend privacy mattered more than care. He had not said, "I know this hurts." He had said, "You need to eat something." And because he was Aaron he had meant, "Stay here. Stay alive. I am holding what I can." Elian had understood him perfectly. Now, on the platform with the train coming closer and the light growing brighter along the tracks, Elian looked at his brother and felt, not for the first time, that the great private failure of Aaron's life was that most people would never know how gentle he actually was. "You could come with me," Elian said. Aaron's face changed by almost nothing. The slightest narrowing at the eyes. The smallest stillness entering an already still body. "No." "Because they'd read it as a threat?" "Yes." "That doesn't mean it would be one." Aaron looked at him for a long moment. "It would." The train pulled into the station with a wash of displaced air and the metallic complaint of brakes engaging. Doors hissed. A few passengers stepped out with the blank inward faces of people not yet fully returned to themselves at this hour. Elian let out a breath that might have been a laugh if either of them had been built for easier laughter. "There it is," he said. "What?" "The honesty people find alarming." Aaron did not answer. Elian shifted the case in his hand. "I'm not walking into a battlefield." Aaron's eyes moved to him. "Direct. Flat. Complete." "Yes," he said. "You are. It's just a battlefield that still permits furniture." For a second, despite himself, Elian smiled. That was another thing Aaron rarely noticed about himself. His bluntness was so exact it sometimes crossed over into wit without stopping to announce the change. The train doors remained open. Somewhere down the platform, a tired station attendant looked up from his console and then away again with the instinctive discretion of someone who had spent years around departures and understood that some goodbyes should not be looked at directly. Elian stepped closer. "When this is over," he said, "I'm taking a month off." Aaron said nothing. "I am," Alien continued. You're going to come to the coast. There's a small place near Halcyon Bay. No signal worth mentioning. No military traffic. No diplomatic traffic. No one asking either of us for anything. The image lived between them for a moment. Small house. Gray water. Wind off the sea. Silence that belonged to weather instead of tension. Aaron could see it. That was the dangerous part. He could see Elian there with his sleeves rolled and a book open face down on the table and a half-finished argument about some treaty clause no one else cared about. He could see himself on the porch in the morning before the light was fully up, holding a mug gone cold in his hand because he had been thinking too long to drink it while it was hot. He could see it, and because he could see it, he distrusted it. Take the month, he said. Elian tilted his head. That sounds almost like agreement. It's not agreement. It's logistics. Of course. Pause. Then Elian said more quietly, you should come anyway. The train doors gave a warning tone. Aaron looked at his brother. Not at the case. Not at the papers. Not at the route schedule folded into the inside pocket of Elian's coat. Just at his face. As though the mind, when given too few seconds, abandons all strategy and chooses the only thing it actually wanted to keep. Don't improvise, Aaron said. Elian blinked once. Of all the things he might have expected, that was not one of them. What? In there, Aaron said. In the room. If something goes wrong, don't improvise to save the meeting. If they shift the structure, if the sequence changes, if the questions stop being questions, don't improvise. Elian studied him. Aaron rarely repeated himself. Rarely clarified. When he did, it was because the thing mattered enough to force language out of him a second time. You think they'll test the frame, Elian said. Yes. You think they've already decided something. Yes. And you still think I should go? Aaron was quiet. Then he said the truest thing in the smallest number of words. I think you're the only one they might listen to. The train's warning tone sounded again. Something moved in Elian's face then. Not fear. Not surprise. Just the brief, unguarded look of a man being handed, in one sentence, the whole difficult shape of how he was seen by the person who knew him best. Not I believe in your mission. Not you can do this. Not be careful. Just, you are the only one they might listen to. Which meant, you are good enough for this. I know exactly how dangerous that makes you. I'm letting you go anyway. Elian stepped forward and, for the first time that morning, did something unscheduled. He embraced his brother. It was brief. One arm around Aaron's shoulders, one hard pressure between them, more force than softness, because softness was never the language they had spoken best. For half a second Aaron did not move. Then his hand came up once between Elian's shoulder blades. A single solid touch. Not holding. Not stopping. Just there. Then Elian stepped back. The train doors began to close. He caught them with one hand, turned, stepped inside, then looked back through the narrowing gap. For a moment the station framed them the way memory would later frame them. One brother on the train. One brother on the platform. Light between them. Distance already beginning its work. Elian said, if this works, you owe me the coast. Aaron looked at him. If this works, he said, I'll buy the house. The doors closed. The train moved. Elian stood inside with the case at his feet and one hand on the overhead rail, watching the platform slide away. Aaron did not wave. He had never waved in his life with any conviction. He simply stood where he was, hands at his sides, coat dark against the station light, growing smaller behind the glass until the curve of the tunnel took him. Elian looked at his reflection in the train window and saw, layered over his own face, the faint afterimage of his brother standing still. He thought, not for the first time, that Aaron understood danger the way musicians understood tempo. Instinctively. In the body. Too early to explain and too deeply to ignore. He thought, too, that if this went well, he would never tell Aaron how close he had come to being right. The city slid past outside in long gray segments. Brick. Steel. Rooftops damp from the night. The first thin wash of morning beginning to touch the edges of things. Elian lowered his gaze to the case by his feet. Inside it were the proposal drafts, the linguistic frameworks, the corridor models, the resource maps, the patient architecture of 3 years spent trying to prove that understanding was more durable than fear. He rested his shoe lightly against the side of the case to steady it as the train picked up speed. Then he closed his eyes for just a moment and saw, not the council chamber waiting for him beyond the distance, but a small house near the sea. Wind against glass. A porch. 2 mugs cooling untouched in the morning air. By the time he opened his eyes again, the train had already gone too far to turn back. The diplomatic transport smelled of recycled air, sterilizing agents, and the faint metallic trace that all long-distance vessels seemed eventually to acquire, as though space itself left a residue on anything that crossed too much of it. Elian had stopped noticing the smell sometime during the second day. By the fifth, he had begun associating it with preparation. The passenger cabin was narrow, quiet, and lit in a low amber register meant to reduce fatigue. It did not reduce fatigue. It simply made everyone look as though they were enduring it gracefully. Across the aisle, a trade representative from the Hellion Exchange had spent the first 19 hours trying to initiate conversation, the next 12 pretending not to be offended by Elian's politeness, and the last stretch of the journey asleep with his mouth slightly open and one hand still resting possessively on a portfolio case. Elian had used the quiet. Pages covered the fold-out tray in front of him. Keth formal structures. Tonal overlays. Conflict de-escalation models translated into 3 different register schemes. Corridor maps marked with resource flow notations. A separate stack containing historical incident summaries, each annotated in the margin with the kinds of questions the Dominion Council was likely to ask if they were asking in good faith, and the kinds they were likely to ask if they were not. He had prepared for both. That was the dangerous part quietly. People who did not believe in it often the train doors gave a warning tone. In fact, Aaron looked at sustained his brother. Hope required not an almost unreasonable tolerance for the repeated labor not at the route schedule folded at into the inside pocket of Elian's with the cabin dimmed and the engine vibration running as though the frame of the vessel given too few seconds mechanical abandons all strategy and chooses the only thing it actually wanted to keep. Inside was a printout of the invitation. Aaron said, "Cream stock." Elian blinked once. Embossed seal. Of all the language he might have expected, that was not one of them. The Dominion Council formally welcomes the envoy of the United Earth Assembly to enter dialogue regarding the possibility of mutual corridor stabilization and future intercivilizational accord. If the question stopped being questions again, don't improvise. Then again more slowly. Elian studied. He had already read it perhaps 40 repeated times. Himself. The phrase possibility of mutual corridor stabilization was elegant enough to force language out of him a second time. But elegant language often hid the actual geometry of power. Elian said. It was the kind of wording that treated trespass as weather and occupation as an administrative inconvenience. And you still think I should go? He made one final note in the margin. Then he said the truest thing in the smallest number of words. Force action into the syntax. I think you're the only one they might listen to. Then he kept his pen and leaned back. The train's warning tone sounded again. Beside his seat something moved in Elian's face then. A field of dark broken by occasional distant lights that were less stars than unguarded look of a man being handed someone with one sentence. He thought of the whole difficult shape of how he was seen by the person who knew him best. Not in the easy way absent sometimes invited. Not I believe in your mission. He thought of him the way one thinks of structural things when moving through uncertainty. You are the only one they might listen to. Load-bearing walls, which meant locked doors. You are good enough for fixed points. I know exactly how dangerous that makes you. Elian looked down at the notes again. Elian stepped forward and for the first time that morning, 3 separate places across 3 separate documents. He embraced his brother. He had already done exactly that, not in content, one arm around Aaron's shoulders, small adjustments, one hard pressure between softer them, transitions, more force than softness, better openings, because softness was never the language to a question that might never come. For half a second, he could feel the habit in himself the way a body feels an old injury between Elian's shoulder blades. The instinct to save the room, single solid touch, to keep the bridge standing one sentence longer than logic advised. Just there. Then Elian stepped back. Then, the train doors began to close. He caught them with one hand, lights shifted from amber to white. Looked back through the narrowing gap. Sounded overhead. For a moment, the station framed them the way memory would later frame the ship's internal voice. One brother on the train, to the point of impersonality. One brother on the platform. All diplomatic passengers prepare for customs transition and reception procedures. Elian said, "If this works, the aisle, you own the Hellion representative woke with a guilty jerk and immediately arranged his face into something he hoped looked dignified. The doors closed. Elian began stacking papers. Elian stood inside with the case. There was no point hurrying. One hand on the overhead rail. Some moments had already chosen their pace before the people inside them realized it. He aligned the folders in his life with any conviction. Slid them into the case. He simply stood where he was with his hands on the translation note. Coat dark against the station light. Growing smaller behind the glass until the curve of the tunnel standard issue. Elian looked at his reflection in the train window and handling 600 layered over his language systems and real-time register image of his brother standing still. He had spent 3 years learning Keth anyway. Not for the first time. Not because that device was inadequate. Danger the way musicians understood translated words faster than people. But they did not always understand what it meant to have cared enough to learn how a sentence wanted to arrive. He thought, too, that if this went well, he would never tell Aaron how close he had come to being right. Outside the viewport, the station came into view. Long gray segments. At first it appeared only as geometry against rooftops damp from the night. Then scale assembled itself around morning, beginning to touch the edges of linked structures. Elian lowered his gaze to the case by his feet. External light bands pulsing in slow drafts from one section to the next. The corridor models, the resource maps, The
too
patient
regular to be
architecture
incidental
and
and
too
too
organic to be purely mechanical
was more durable than
Elian
fear.
opened his notes again
He
and
rested
found the
his
line
shoe
he
lightly
wanted.
against the side
Ambient
of the case
panel
to steady
pulse,
it as the train
probable
picked up
Keth
speed.
neuroenvironmental
Then he
modulation.
closed his eyes for just a
Civilian
moment and
reports
saw,
suggest
not the council chamber waiting for him beyond the regulation,
but a small
humans
house
typically
near the sea.
interpret as
Wind
calming or
against
oppressive
glass.
depending on
A
stress
porch.
baseline.
2 mugs
He looked
cooling
back
untouched
out,
in the morning
calming
air.
he thought.
By the
Which
time
meant
he opened his
almost
eyes
certainly
again,
that calm
the
was
train
not
had
its
already
only
gone
gone
too
to
far
effect.
to turn back.
The transport
The
docked
diplomatic
without
transport
ceremony.
smelled of recycled
There was no
air,
visible
sterilizing
welcome
agents,
delegation through the
and
airlock
a faint
glass.
metallic trace that
No
all
cluster of
long-distance
protocol
vessels
staff.
seemed eventually to
No
acquire,
banners, as though
no
space itself
insignia
left a
projected
residue
on
on the receiving
that
wall.
crossed too much of it.
Only a corridor
Elian
lit
had
in the
stopped
same
noticing
underpanel
the
rhythm
smell
as the
since the
station
second
exterior,
day,
and beyond
by
that,
the fifth
two figures
he had
began
begun
associating
associating
it
it
with
with
distance from
preparation.
one another. The passenger cabin
Elian
was
had
narrow,
seen recordings,
quiet, and lit in a low amber register meant to reduce
body
fatigue.
language breakdown,
It did not
slowed to
reduce
half
fatigue.
speed and annotated
It simply
line
made
by
everyone
line.
look as though
None
they
of
were
it
enduring
prepared
it
the body
gracefully.
for the reality
Across
of another
the aisle,
species
a trade
occupying the same
representative from the
physical
Hellion
space.
Exchange had
They
spent
were
the
tall,
first 19
not
hours
only in
trying
height
to
but in
initiate
verbal
conversation.
conversation.
The
The eye
next
pulled
pulled
upward
pretending
by the
not to be
segmented
offended
arrangement
by
of the
Elian's
torso
politeness,
and the precise
and the last
economy of
stretch of the
posture.
journey asleep
Their
with his
skin
mouth
was a
slightly
smooth
open
matte
and
gray
one hand
overlaid
still
with
resting
slow-moving
possessively
currents
on
of
a
color that
portfolio
shifted
case.
beneath the surface
Elian
rather
had
than on
used
it.
the quiet.
The effect was
Pages
less like
covered the
pigment than
fold-down
weather
tray in
beneath
front
of
of
him.
him.
Both
Formal
wore formal
structures,
reception bands
tonal
at the shoulder
overlays,
joints.
conflict
Deep
de-escalation models translated
adjacent
into
but
three
not
different
senior.
register schemes.
Escort class,
Corridor
Elian thought.
maps marked with
Important
resource
enough
flow
to convey
notations.
status.
A separate
important
stack
enough to
containing
signify
historical
welcome.
incident summaries,
The airlock
each
cycled
annotated
open.
in the margin
A
with the
wash of
kinds of
cooler air
questions the
passed
Dominion
over him.
Council was likely to
He
ask
stepped
if they were
forward
asking
carrying
in
the
good
case in
faith,
his left hand,
and the kinds they
his
were
right
likely
free
to
and
ask if they
visible,
were not by instinct
He had prepared
but by
for
prior
both.
decision. The first movement of every meeting mattered. The taller of the two Keth inclined its head by a degree exactly matching formal reception protocol. Envoy Elian Vey, it said in accented but serviceable standard. You are received. Then
Not welcome,
Elian said more
not
quietly,
honored,
you should
received.
come anyway. Elian inclined his head and gave a warning tone. I thanked the
Aran
Dominion
looked at his
Council
brother.
for its reception.
Not at the case.
He answered
Not
in
at the
standard
papers.
deliberately first.
Not at the route
Not to
schedule
accommodate
folded
them.
into the inside
To
pocket
establish
of
the
Elian's
order
coat.
of exchange.
Just at his
Then,
face.
before either
As though the
escort could
mind,
respond,
when given
he
too few
shifted into
seconds,
Keth formal
abandons
register.
all strategy and
I
chooses
enter
the
under
only
offered
thing it actually
structure
wanted
and
to
with
keep.
full intention
Don't
toward
improvise,
ordered speech.
Aran said.
The color beneath
Elian
both
blinked
escorts'
once.
skin altered
Of
at
all
once.
the things he might have
Not
expected,
dramatically,
that was not one
just
of them.
enough.
What?
A small ripple
In
of
there?
muted silver
Aran
blue
said.
traveling beneath
In the
the
room.
gray. If something
Surprise.
goes wrong, don't
Not shock.
improvise to save the
Not
meeting.
admiration.
If they shift
Just
the
the
structure,
quiet
if the sequence
recalculation that
changes,
occurs when
if the
expectation
question stop
rises
rises
by a
questions,
measurable
don't
amount.
improvise.
Good, Elian
Elian
thought.
studied him.
Not because
Aran
surprise was
rarely
victory.
repeated himself.
Because surprise
Rarely
created
clarified.
instability,
When
and
he did, it was
instability
because the
properly
thing mattered
used
enough
could
to
become
force
attention.
language out of him a
The
second
escort
time.
on the right answered
You
him
think
in
they'll
Keth.
test the frame?
Your chamber
Elian
has been
said.
prepared. Yes.
The high
You
convocation
think they've
receives
already
formal
decided
address
something?
on station morning.
Yes. Station
And you
morning.
still think I should
Not
go?
immediately.
Aran was quiet.
Elian made the conversion
said the
automatically
truest
in
thing
the
in
back
the
of his
smallest
mind
number of
and
words.
arrived at the number
I
without
think you're the
visible
only one they
pause.
might listen to.
14 hours.
The train's warning
Long
tone
enough to
sounded
exhaust.
again.
Long
Something
enough to
moved in
isolate.
Elian's face then.
Long enough for someone on
fear.
the other side to
Not
confirm
surprise.
decisions already
Just
made.
the brief, unguarded look
He
of a
nodded
man
once
being
as though
handed
the timing
in one
had no
sentence
significance.
the whole difficult
I am
shape
prepared
of how
to
he
follow
was
the
seen by the
offered
person who knew
sequence.
him best.
The escorts
Not I
turned to
believe
leave
in your
in
mission.
synchrony.
Not
You
can
follow
do
it.
this. The
Not be
station
careful.
interior was
Just,
quieter than
you are
any
the only
human
one they
structure
might
he had
listen
ever
to.
been inside.
Which meant,
You
not
are good
silent.
enough for this.
Silence had
I know
edges.
exactly how
This
dangerous
place
that
had
makes
atmosphere
you.
instead.
I'm letting you go
A
anyway.
continual low
Elian
register
stepped
hum
forward
created by
and
the
for
pulsing
first
time
time that
bands
morning,
beneath the
did
floor
something
panels and the
unscheduled.
almost
He
imperceptible
embraced
movement
his
of
brother.
air through
It was
unseen
brief.
vents.
One
It felt
arm
less
around
like
Aran's
entering
shoulders,
architecture than
one
entering
hard
the
pressure
inside of a
between them,
sustained thought.
more force than
The
softness,
corridors were curved
because
without
softness was
appearing
never the
soft.
language they had spoken
Surfaces
best.
rose into one
For half
another
a second,
in
Aran
continuous
did
dark
not move.
planes broken only
Then his
by
hand
light
came up
seams
once
and the
occasional
occasional
inset
shoulder
panel of
blades.
muted
A
metallic
single
lattice
solid
work.
touch.
No windows.
Not holding.
No public
Not stopping.
displays.
Just
no
there.
decorative
Then
objects of
Elian
any
stepped
kind.
back.
Everything
train
was
doors
functional,
began to close.
and every function
He
had
caught
been
them with
designed
by a civilization that regarded excess explanation as either weakness or waste. For a moment the station framed him the way memory would later frame
not because he intended
one
to,
brother on the train,
because Aaron would have.
one brother on the platform,
Right.
light between
Forward
them,
split.
distance
Security
already
scene.
beginning its work.
Service access
Alien
flush
said,
with wall line.
if this works,
Ceiling
you owe me
node
the
at the
coast.
junction,
Likely
Aaron looked at him.
observational. If
He
this
almost
works,
smiled at
he
himself.
said, I'll buy
That
the
was how
house.
influence
The
survived
doors
distance.
closed. One
The train
mind
moved.
leaving grooves inside
Alien
another.
stood inside with
The
the case at
escorts
his
led him
feet
through
and one
3
hand on the
corridor
overhead
shifts,
rail,
one vertical
watching the
lift,
platform
and a
slide
final
away.
passage
Aaron
noticeably
did not
narrower
wave.
than the others.
He had never waved in his
Intentional
life with
compression
any
before
conviction.
guest quarters, he
He
thought.
simply stood where
Spatial
he was,
reduction
hands at
before
his sides,
confinement
coat
registered
dark
as
against
accommodation.
light.
The
Growing
room they
smaller
gave him
behind
was
the
simple
glass
enough
until
to be
the
honest
curve of
or
the tunnel
insulting.
took him.
A
sleek
Alien looked at his
built into the
reflection in the
wall.
train
A
window
low
and saw,
table.
layered
single
over his
chair.
own face,
A recessed
the faint
wash unit.
afterimage of his
Blank
brother standing
surfaces.
still.
No
He
personal
thought,
amenities.
not for the first time,
No written
that
materials.
Arn understood danger
No
the way
hospitality
musicians
tray.
understood tempo.
No water.
Instinctively,
The escort
in
stopped
the
at
body.
the threshold.
Too early to
Station
explain
warning,
and too
said the
deeply
one
to
on the
ignore.
left.
He
The
thought
door
too
closed
that if this went well, he would never tell Arn how close he had come to being right. The city stood in the middle of the room for a moment without moving. Then he set the case on the table and opened it.
From the night.
No water.
The first thin
That
wash
detail
of morning
remained
beginning
where it
to
was.
touch the edges
Not
of things.
because it mattered physically,
Elian lowered
not
his
yet.
gaze to the case
Because
by his
deprivation
feet.
was one of the oldest
Inside it
forms
were
of
the
communication
proposal
power
drafts,
ever
the linguistic
invented,
frameworks,
and
the
civilizations
corridor
did
models,
not
the
outgrow
resource
old
maps,
languages
the
simply
patient
because they
architecture
developed
of new
3 years spent
technology.
trying to prove
He
that
sat,
understanding was
took
more
out the
durable
notes,
than fear.
turned to the section
He
on
rested
layered
his
Keth
shoe
negation
lightly against the
structures.
side of the case
Work.
to steady it as
Hours
the train
moved in
picked
the
up
station's
speed.
strange lightless
Then he
logic.
closed his eyes for just
Without
a moment
windows,
and
time
saw,
became
not the
procedural.
council chamber
Pages
waiting for him
completed.
beyond the distance,
Arguments
but a
refined.
small house near the
Breathing
sea,
measured against
wind
the low
against
pulse
glass,
under the floor.
a porch.
Once,
Two
after
mugs
what he
cooling
judged to be
untouched
perhaps
in the
6
morning
hours,
air, he
by the
stood
time
and
he
crossed
opened
the
his
room
eyes
only
again,
to understand
the
its
train had
dimensions
already gone
physically.
too far to
8
turn
steps
back.
long.
The
5
diplomatic
wide.
transport
3
smelled of
possible
recycled
seams
air,
in the wall
sterilizing
paneling,
agents,
of which only
and
one
the
was
faint
an actual
metallic
door.
trace that all
He wrote that
long-distance
down for
vessels
no
seemed
reason
eventually
he could
to
defend.
acquire.
Later,
As though space
after
itself
another
left
interval
a
of
residue
work,
on
he
anything
found
that
himself
crossed too much
studying
of
the
it.
upper vent lattice
Elian
and
had stopped
estimating the
noticing the
airflow
smell
output.
sometime during
Then
the
the
second
position
day.
of the floor
By the
seams.
fifth, he had
Then the
begun
rhythm with
associating
which
it with
distant
preparation.
corridor traffic
The
passed by
passenger
beyond the
cabin
wall.
was narrow,
He
quiet,
set the pen down
and lit in a low
looked at
amber
what he had
register
written in
meant
the
to
margin.
reduce fatigue.
3 exits
It did not
probable.
reduce fatigue.
Northeast
It
corridor
simply made
traffic
everyone
drop
look
after
as though they were
0200
enduring
rotation
rotation
pattern
pattern
holds.
Across the
He
aisle,
stared at the
a
line
trade
for several
representative
seconds.
from the Hellion
Then,
Exchange
because
had spent
honesty
the first
with
19
oneself
hours
was one
trying
of the
to
few
initiate
disciplines he
conversation.
trusted completely,
The next
he
12
wrote
pretending
beneath
not
it.
to be offended by
Arn would have
Elian's
counted
politeness.
sooner. And the
For the
last
first
stretch
time
of the
since
journey
docking,
asleep
his
with
mouth
mouth
moved very
slightly open
slightly.
and one hand still resting possessively on a portfolio case.
Elian had used the quiet. Pages covered the fold-out tray in front of him. Keth formal structures. Tonal overlays. Conflict de-escalation models translated into 3 different register schemes. Corridor maps marked with resource flow notations. A separate stack containing historical incident summaries, each annotated in the margin with the kinds of questions the Dominion Council was likely to ask if they were asking in good faith, and the kinds they were likely to ask if they were not. He had prepared for both.
Not
Then
a
Elian
smile.
said more quietly,
Something smaller than
"You
that.
should come anyway."
A private
The train
acknowledgement
doors
of the
gave a
person not
warning
in the
tone.
room.
He
Arn
closed
looked at
the
his
notebook.
brother.
Then
Not at
opened
the
it
case.
again and returned
Not
to
at
work,
the papers.
because that was what there
Not
was
at
to
the
do
route
while
schedule
waiting
for
for
other
other people
people
to
to
decide
decide
what kind of meeting they intended
this
to be.
Just at his face.
At some point the
As though
station
the
shifted
mind,
almost
when given too few
imperceptibly
seconds,
around him, abandons
not
all strategy
mechanically,
and chooses the only thing it
environmentally.
actually wanted
The
to
pulse
keep.
beneath the floor
Don't
changed
improvise,
tempo by a fraction. Arn said.
The ambient
Elian
hum
blinked
rose
once.
into a brighter
Of
register.
all the things he might have
Somewhere
expected,
deep in the
that was
walls,
not one of them.
Systems moved
What?
from one mode into
In there?
another with the
Arn
invisible
said.
coordination
In the
of a
room.
habitat
If
large
something
enough
goes
to have its
wrong,
own
don't
version of
improvise
dawn.
to save the meeting.
Station morning.
If they shift the
A tone
structure
sounded
into the
at the
sequence
door.
changes,
The seal
if the
released.
questions stopped being
2
questions,
different escorts
don't
stood
improvise.
outside. These wore
Elian
deeper
studied
red
him.
bands.
Arn
Their
rarely
skin moved
repeated
in
himself.
slower colors.
Rarely clarified.
Formal register.
When he did,
One
it
of
was
them
because
said
the
in
thing
Keth,
mattered enough
the
to
high
force language
convocation
out of him a
receives.
second time. Elian
You
closed
think
the
they'll
final
test the
folder.
frame?
Elian
Placed the
said.
translation node
Yes.
behind his left
You
ear.
think they've already
Lifted the
decided
case.
something. Then he stepped Yes.
into the corridor and
you
followed
still
them
think
toward
I
the
should
center
go?
of the station.
Arn was
toward
quiet.
the room that had been
Then
waiting
he
for
said
him
the
long
truest
before
thing in
he
the
arrived,
smallest number of
carrying
words.
with him 3
I
years
think
of
you're
work,
the only
7
one they might
versions of
listen
the same
to.
opening
The
statement,
train's warning
and the
tone sounded
increasingly
again.
quiet hope that if
Something
he could
moved
find the
in
right
Elian's
structure
face
fast
then.
enough,
Not
the room
fear.
might still choose not to
surprise.
become what Arn
Just
had
the
feared
brief,
it already
unguarded
was.
look of a man
The
being
chamber was
handed
built
in
to
one
alter
sentence.
scale. The whole
That was
difficult
Elian's
shape
first
of how
thought
he
when
was
he
seen
stepped
by the
through the
person
final
who knew him
threshold,
best.
and the room
Not
revealed
I
itself
believe in your
all at
mission.
once.
Not you
can
not
do this.
large in the human
Not be
sense
careful.
of grandeur,
Just
not ornate.
You are the only one
not
they might
dramatic
listen
by
to.
any decorative
Which
measure.
meant you are
But
good enough for
proportioned
this.
with such
I
deliberate
know exactly
intelligence
how
that the
dangerous
body
that makes
understood
you.
before the
I'm
mind
letting
did
you
what
go
place
anyway.
had been assigned
Elian
to it.
stepped forward
The floor
and for the
opened
first
in a
time that
perfect
morning.
circle. Did
The
something
ceiling rose
unscheduled.
higher than it
He
needed
embraced
to.
his brother.
The outer wall
It was
curved
brief.
upward in dark
One
matte
arm
planes
around
interrupted
shoulders,
by 12
one
elevated
hard pressure
stations
between
arranged
them,
in a
more
gradual
force than
ascending
softness.
Each
Because
one
softness
occupied was never the
Each
language
one
they
sat
had
just
spoken
far enough
best.
above the center
For half
floor
a
to make
second
any
Aaron
person
did not
standing
move.
below them feel
Then
less
his
like a
hand
guest
came up
and
once
more like a
between
specimen
Ellie and
being
shoulder
considered from a
blades.
useful height.
A single solid
No
touch.
chair waited in the
Not
center.
holding.
No
Not
table.
stopping.
No
Just
surface
there.
for notes.
Then Ellie
The
stepped
escorts
back.
peeled away
The
and
train
left
doors
him there.
began to close.
For one brief
He
second,
caught them
Ellie
with one
stood
hand,
alone
turned,
beneath 12
stepped
pairs of
inside,
eyes,
then
and
looked
felt
back
the
through
room
the narrowing
complete its
gap.
intended effect
For a
with
moment
cold
the station
efficiency.
framed them the
The
way
architecture
memory would
did
later
not say
frame
you
them.
are unwelcome.
One brother on
It
the
said
train.
something much
One
older
brother
and more
on the
dangerous.
platform. You are
Light
small
between
here.
them. He set the
Distance
case
already
down at the
beginning
edge of
its
the
work.
speaking mark.
Elliot
Opened
said,
it, removed
if this
only the
works,
top
you owe
folder,
me the
then
coast.
stopped. Aaron looked at him.
There would be no place to use it,
he
and
said,
the movement of
"I'll
holding
buy the
papers in the
house."
center of
The
that room
doors
would only
closed.
make him appear
The
what they
train moved.
expected him to be.
Elian stood
Dependent
inside
on
with the case
preparation,
at his feet
dependent
and
on
one
script,
hand on the
one
overhead
more
rail,
soft-bodied
watching
envoy
the
from a
platform
species
slide
they had
away.
already decided
Aaron did
mistook
not wave.
language for leverage.
He
He had never waved in
closed
his
the case,
life with any
left
conviction.
it where it was.
He simply
Walked to
stood
the
where he
speaking
was,
mark with
hands at
empty
his
hands.
sides, coat
12
dark
members
against
of
the
the
station
high
light,
convocation watched
growing
him.
smaller
Their
behind the
robes
glass
were
until
deep
the
red,
curve of the tunnel
color
took
of
him.
dried iron
Elian
and
looked at his
institutional
reflection
memory.
in the train window
Their
and
skin
saw,
moved in different
layered
degrees
over
of
his own
color
face,
beneath the gray
the
surface.
faint afterimage
Some
of his
slow,
brother
some
standing
nearly
still.
Some
He thought,
carrying
not
such
for the
controlled
first
traces
time,
of motion
that
that
only
only
someone who had
danger the
spent
way
3 years
musicians
learning
understood
Catholic
tempo.
expression would have noticed they were not
Instinctively,
still at all,
in the body,
merely performing
too early
stillness
to
for rank
explain,
and too deeply
the
to
highest
ignore.
seat,
He
positioned
thought
one
too
degree
that if
above
this
all
went
the
well,
others,
he would
belonged
never
to the
tell
first
Aaron how
voice,
close he had come to
Draven.
being right.
Elian
The city
recognized
slipped
him
past
immediately
outside
from the
in long
archival
gray briefing
segments.
images.
Brick,
Older than
steel,
most Keth of
rooftops
comparable
damp
office.
from the night.
His skin
The
color
first
so
thin
still
wash
had
of warning
warning
on
beginning to
absence.
touch the edges
In
of
Keth
things.
bodily rhetoric,
Elian lowered
stillness
his
at that
gaze to
level
the
did
case
not
by his
signify
feet.
calm.
Inside it were the
signified
proposal
decision
draft,
already
the
completed,
linguistic frameworks,
which meant
the
one of
corridor
two
models,
things.
the resource
Either the
maps,
room had already
the patient
decided
architecture
against
of
him,
3 years spent
or the
trying to
room had
prove that
decided
understanding
nothing
was more
except that he would
durable than
not be
fear.
allowed to see the process.
He rested his
Neither
shoe lightly
possibility
against the
was
side
good.
of the case to
Draven
steady it as
spoke
the
first
train
in
picked
formal
up speed.
speed.
His
Then he
voice
closed
low
his
and
eyes for
evenly
just a
resonant,
moment and saw,
every tonal
not
layer
the council
perfectly
chamber
controlled.
waiting for him beyond the
Envoy
distance,
of the United Earth
but a small
Assembly.
house near the sea.
You were received under
Wind
offered
against glass.
structure.
A
You may
porch.
present your
2 mugs
request,
cooling untouched in the morning air. Not terms.
By the time he opened his
Request.
eyes again,
Elian
the train
felt the
had
word
already
land
gone
and
too
chose
far
not
to
to fight
turn
him
back.
The
Some
diplomatic
battles and
transport
language
were
smelled
worth
of
having
recycled
immediately.
air,
Others
sterilizing
became more
agents,
useful
and
if
the
allowed
faint
to sit on the
metallic trace
table
that all
untouched for a
long-distance
while,
vessels seemed
where
eventually
everyone in
to
the room
acquire,
could pretend
as
not
though
to be
space
looking at
itself
them.
left a
He
residue on
inclined
anything
his
that
head.
crossed too much
Then
of it.
he answered in formal
Elian had
Cath.
stopped noticing
Not
the
the
smell
functional
sometime during the
diplomatic
second
version
day.
used in
By the
interspecies
fifth,
briefings.
he had begun associating
Not
it
the
with
simplified
preparation.
register
The
designed for
passenger
machine
cabin was
correction.
narrow, quiet,
full thing,
and lit in a
layered.
low amber register meant to reduce fatigue. It did not reduce fatigue. It simply made everyone look as though they were enduring it gracefully. Across the aisle, a trade representative from the Hellion Exchange had spent the first 19 hours trying to initiate conversation, the next 12 pretending not to be offended by Elian's politeness, and the last stretch of the journey asleep with his mouth slightly open and one hand still resting possessively on a portfolio case. Elian had used the quiet. Pages covered the fold-out tray in front of him. Keth formal structures. Tonal overlays. Conflict de-escalation models translated into 3 different register schemes. Corridor maps marked with resource flow notations. A separate stack containing historical incident summaries, each annotated in the margin with the kinds of questions the Dominion Council was likely to ask if they were asking in good faith, and the kinds they were likely to ask if they were not. He had prepared for both. Then Elian said more quietly, "You should come anyway." The train doors gave a warning tone. Aaron looked at his brother. Not at the case. Not at the papers. Not at the route schedule folded into the inside pocket of Elian's coat. Just at his face. As though the mind, when given too few seconds, abandons all strategy and chooses the only thing it actually wanted to keep. "Don't improvise," Aaron said. Elian blinked once. Of all the things he might have expected, that was not one of them. "What?" "In there," Aaron said. "In the room. If something goes wrong, don't improvise to save the meeting. If they shift the structure, if the sequence changes, if the questions stop being questions, don't improvise." Elian studied him. Aaron rarely repeated himself. Rarely clarified. When he did, it was because the thing mattered enough to force language out of him a second time. "You think they'll test the frame?" Elian said. "Yes." "You think they've already decided something?" "Yes." "And you still think I should go?" Aaron was quiet. Then he said the truest thing in the smallest number of words. "I think you're the only one they might listen to." The train's warning tone sounded again. Something moved in Elian's face then. Not fear. Not surprise. Just the brief, unguarded look of a man being handed, in one sentence, the whole difficult shape of how he was seen by the person who knew him best. Not "I believe in your mission." Not "you can do this." Not "be careful." Just, "You are the only one they might listen to." Which meant, "You are good enough for this. I know exactly how dangerous that makes you. I'm letting you go anyway." Elian stepped forward and, for the first time that morning, did something unscheduled. He embraced his brother. It was brief. One arm around Aaron's shoulders, one hard pressure between them, more force than softness, because softness was never the language they had spoken best. For half a second Aaron did not move. Then his hand came up once between Elian's shoulder blades. A single solid touch. Not holding. Not stopping. Just there. Then Elian stepped back. The train doors began to close.
He caught them with one hand, turned, stepped inside, then looked back through the narrowing gap. For a moment the station framed them the way memory would later frame them. One brother on the train. One brother on the platform. Light between them. Distance already beginning its work. Elian said, "If this works, you owe me the coast." Aaron looked at him. "If this works," he said, "I'll buy the house." The doors closed. The train moved. Elian stood inside with the case at his feet and one hand on the overhead rail, watching the platform slide away. Aaron did not wave. He had never waved in his life with any conviction. He simply stood where he was, hands at his sides, coat dark against the station light, growing smaller behind the glass until the curve of the tunnel took him. Elian looked at his reflection in the train window and saw, layered over his own face, the faint afterimage of his brother standing still. He thought, not for the first time, that Aaron understood danger the way musicians understood tempo. Instinctively. In the body. Too early to explain and too deeply to ignore. He thought, too, that if this went well he would never tell Aaron how close he had come to being right. The city slid past outside in long gray segments. Brick. Steel. Rooftops damp from the night. The first thin wash of morning beginning to touch the edges of things. Elian lowered his gaze to the case by his feet. Inside it were the proposal drafts, the linguistic frameworks, the corridor models, the resource maps, the patient architecture of 3 years spent trying to prove that understanding was more durable than fear. He rested his shoe lightly against the side of the case to steady it as the train picked up speed. Then he closed his eyes for just a moment and saw, not the council chamber waiting for him beyond the distance, but a small house near the sea. Wind against glass. A porch. 2 mugs cooling untouched in the morning air. By the time he opened his eyes again, the train had already gone too far to turn back. The diplomatic transport smelled of recycled air, sterilizing agents, and the faint metallic trace that all long-distance vessels seemed eventually to acquire, as though space itself left a residue on anything that crossed too much of it. Elian had stopped noticing the smell sometime during the 2nd day. By the 5th he had begun associating it with preparation. The passenger cabin was narrow, quiet, and lit in a low amber register meant to reduce fatigue. It did not reduce fatigue. It simply made everyone look as though they were enduring it gracefully. Across the aisle, a trade representative from the Hellion Exchange had spent the first 19 hours trying to initiate conversation, the next 12 pretending not to be offended by Elian's politeness, and the last stretch of the journey asleep with his mouth slightly open and one hand still resting possessively on a portfolio case. Elian had used the quiet. Pages covered the fold-out tray in front of him. Keth formal structures. Tonal overlays. Conflict de-escalation models translated into 3 different register schemes. Corridor maps marked with resource flow notations. A separate stack containing historical incident summaries, each annotated in the margin with the kinds of questions the Dominion Council was likely to ask if they were asking in good faith, and the kinds they were likely to ask if they were not. He had prepared for both. Elian kept his breathing level. Kept his hands still. Inside, hope rose sharp and quick, dangerous as flame in dry brush. He knew better than to trust it fully. But there are moments in difficult rooms when possibility enters with such clean force that refusing to feel it would be its own kind of dishonesty. For 11 minutes, the chamber became what he had spent 3 years trying to make possible. A room where the Keth did not have to agree with him in order to engage with him. A room where his language had reached theirs. A room where a future could, at least theoretically, be built from the fact that 2 structures had finally begun touching edges without immediately trying to tear each other apart. He answered questions on military exit timing. On phased corridor administration. On shared audit oversight. On fuel redistribution incentives. He cited Keth legal precedent twice, both correctly. At one point the 7th voice interrupted not to challenge him, but to clarify one of Aritha's tonal assumptions for the benefit of the record. That was when Elian understood he had done something larger than simple fluency. He had shifted the room's expectation of his legitimacy. Not enough to win. Enough to matter. Enough, perhaps, to survive the day. Across the arc, Draven remained very still. That did not leave Elian's mind. Even while answering. Even while adjusting his syntax. Even while feeling the room become briefly inhabitable. The first voice's stillness had changed quality. Not looser. Not more engaged. If anything, more sealed. As though everything happening beneath him had already been incorporated into a private outcome whose shape no one else had yet been permitted to see. Elian felt it and continued anyway. Because sometimes one voice opening is enough to force record. Because sometimes getting the argument inside the room mattered even if the room later chose to betray it. Because history was not only what powers decided. It was also what could be proven to have been possible before power refused it. So he kept going. At the 40-minute mark he moved into the final section of the framework. The part he had rewritten 4 times during transit and twice more in the guest chamber. The part concerning phased demilitarization of the 17 primary corridor installations. He had chosen the order carefully. Not first because first would have made it seem like demand. Not last because last would have made it seem like trap. Here, after the room had been made to think, was where the ask could appear as the natural extension of the logic already established. He named the 17 sites. Explained their centrality. Not as symbols. As infrastructure. Fuel. Routing. Maintenance. Processing. Throughput spine. Remove military pressure from those 17 and the corridor stopped behaving like a front line and began behaving like a shared artery. It was elegant. It was true. Arith understood immediately. Elian saw it in the sharp flare of color under his skin. The 5th voice leaned forward. The 9th began saying something to the 11th in low formal subregister, likely a procedural question about enforceability. For one suspended, impossible moment Elian thought, this might actually hold. Then the guards moved. There was no announcement. No formal interruption. No accusation entered into the record. No procedural statement from Draven. No ceremonial language of breach, insult, contamination, or offense. Nothing that would have allowed the room to absorb what was happening into an understandable ritual. They simply stepped forward from the perimeter in absolute silence, as if they had been waiting not for a decision, but for a timing cue. For half a second Elian did not process it. The mind is slower than danger when danger arrives in a shape reality has not prepared it to accept. He stopped speaking. The chamber remained perfectly lit. The convocation remained seated. Arith rose halfway from his station. Not fully. Just enough to break the choreography. Color flashed hard beneath his skin, shock, objection, something very near grief if grief had a bureaucratic form. Elian had time for one clear thought. Not a noble one. Not the sort of thought stories later assigned to men in decisive moments. Just this. 3 exits. The translation node behind his ear remained warm. It kept working. That was the detail that would stay with him even as the rest of the moment accelerated beyond proportion. Not the guard's speed. Not the chamber. Not the 12 watching figures. The node. Its soft, faithful pressure against his skin. Its little pulse of adaptive response. Its complete mechanical commitment to the job it had been made to do. Words continued arriving in his ear. A perimeter systems note. A shift in corridor pressure. A procedural correction from one of the recording clerks at the back of the chamber. Aritha's voice, sharper now, speaking over someone. The node translated everything with equal devotion. It did not know what kind of room it had become. The guards were close enough now that Elian could see the minute abrasion lines across the surface of one restraint band, where repeated fastening had worn the finish thin at the edges. Such useless details. Such human details to notice at a time like this. He turned his head once toward the high arc. Toward Draven. The first voice's skin had gone flat white. Not pale. White. The Keth color of finality. Not anger. Not triumph. The color a system took on when it had categorized something as already complete. Arith said something, one hard phrase, formal register cracking under strain. The node rendered it imperfectly. Improperly concluded. Or perhaps. Conclusion cannot hold. Something like that. It did not matter. Nothing was going to say anything into white. The guards took his arms. The room did not change. That was the cruelty of it. No alarm. No urgency. No visible discomfort for most of the convocation. The chamber remained what it had been built to be, precise, elevated, balanced, devoted to the appearance of order even while order was being used as a blade. The broadcast nodes in the ceiling were active. Elian knew they were active because he had read the technical specifications of Keth convocation chambers as part of his preparation. Public record events used a standard outward array tied to the Dominion's civil frequency. This session had been listed 3 days earlier as a significant diplomatic development, which meant the signal was already going out. Not just within the station. To the corridor. To aligned governments. To any civilization with a receiver tuned to Keth public channels. Humanity included. He knew this with the cold, lucid certainty of a mind that had spent too long believing knowledge could save a room and was now forced to watch knowledge survive only as witness. The node kept feeding him words. A weather update from the surface of Keth Prime. A maintenance notice for northeastern corridor pressure cycling. A recording clerk marking sequence alignment. The chamber systems did not care what else was happening. They had tasks. They were performing them. That, more than the guards, more than the white in Draven's skin, more than the fact of betrayal, made the moment suddenly unbearable. Not the violence. The continuity. That the world, when it chose cruelty, so often chose to remain procedural while doing it. The signal cut a second later. Or perhaps the node lost broadcast priority. Or perhaps one of the guards disabled some portion of external relay as they moved him. He never knew. The last thing it translated into his ear was a routine station notice. Northeast corridor unmonitored after 0200 due to pressure recalibration. He almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because even now the station was still handing him information. Still behaving as though this were a day in which details might remain useful. Then the room folded into motion, and whatever came after would belong to everyone watching. The broadcast reached Earth in fragments. Not because the signal was damaged. Because meaning always arrived that way first. Broken across distance, incomplete at the edges, asking the mind to assemble the shape before the heart had agreed to receive it. In government offices, reception arrays translated the Keth civil band into local feed structures and routed it according to protocol. In military command centers, analysts pulled the metadata before the video had fully buffered. In apartments, in transit lounges, in university halls, in the dim common rooms of stations rotating through artificial night, screens lit with a language most people did not understand and an image they understood immediately. A chamber. A human envoy. Guards moving. No one needed the translation for the important part. Shock moved faster than sound. On Titan Station, the notification arrived at 0340 local command time. It appeared first as a priority flag in the upper right corner of the wall display in General Marcus Vale's office. Then as a duplicate alert on the private military channel. Then as a physical print command on the side terminal outside the office because his adjutant, Rowan, still printed high-priority notices on paper when the matter looked like the kind of thing a person should be able to hold in their hands. Rowan would later be asked why. He would not have a good answer. Only the old one. Some information belonged on paper because paper made it harder to pretend you had not seen it. The printer in the outer office woke with a soft mechanical shudder. Rowan looked over from his station, saw the red band header, and stood up before the sheet had fully cleared the tray. He was 36, precise by temperament, unremarkable in the useful way that let competent men move through institutions without attracting unnecessary friction. He had served under Marcus for 5 years and had come to understand, gradually and without ceremony, that working for the general meant developing instincts most officers did not need. One of those instincts was this. When a machine decided at 0340 that something was urgent enough to become paper, do not read it twice before moving. He took the page. Read it once. Then again. For a moment he remained very still, his eyes fixed on the text while his brain did the human thing of attempting, out of reflex and kindness to itself, to propose alternate interpretations. There were none. The notice was brief. Too brief, given its contents. UA Diplomatic Envoy Elian Vale confirmed deceased following Dominion convocation proceeding. Public Keth broadcast attached. Immediate command-level review authorized. Below that, in smaller print, an automated cross-reference. Next of kin, General Marcus Vale. Rowan lifted his eyes toward the open office door. Marcus was inside, exactly where he always was when he should have been asleep and never was. Standing at the display wall with 3 layered star maps open at once, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table behind him, body angled not toward rest but toward continuation. The maps threw pale blue light across the room and caught in the silver at his temples, making him look less tired than carved. He had been working boundary calculations for the outer corridor disputes. Not the Keth file specifically. 3 other problems. Supply routing. Fleet posture. A quiet logistics instability near the Perseus line that was not yet officially a crisis but was approaching the shape of one. Marcus worked most usefully, Rowan had learned, when he was already 3 problems ahead of the one the room believed it was discussing. He knocked once against the frame. Marcus looked up. His eyes went first to Rowan's face, then to the paper in Rowan's hand. That was enough. The body knows before language does when certain kinds of news enter a room. Sir, Rowan said. He crossed the office, laid the paper on the desk and stepped back. Not regulation distance. Farther. The sort of space a person leaves around heat. Marcus looked at the page. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it first. That, too, Rowan would remember later, the order of events. The 2 seconds in which Marcus stood entirely still with the notice on the desk between them, as though stillness itself were a tool for forcing time to declare exactly what kind of moment this was. Then he picked it up. Read it once. No visible reaction crossed his face. Not shock. Not denial. Not the freezing blankness people mistook for composure in others and rarely possessed themselves. Marcus did not go blank. His expression remained what it had been 1 second before, controlled, spare, unornamented by anything unnecessary. Only the room changed. Something in it tightened. Not atmospherically. Structurally. As though a beam deep inside the building had just taken new weight and everything attached to it knew, without needing to be told, that strain calculations were now being redone. Rowan stood where he was and felt for the first time in 5 years, something very close to fear. Not of Marcus. Of the shape that absolute control took when grief entered it and found no visible place to go. Marcus set the page down. Parallel to the edge of the desk. Exactly. The stars on the wall display continued burning in their fixed positions. A route line blinked near the outer corridor. Somewhere beyond the office, the station's air circulation changed register for night cycle maintenance. A technician passed in the hall outside with a tool case that clicked faintly against his leg at each step. The universe, having delivered its fact, continued. Marcus pressed the comm. Get me the last 90 days of Dominion territorial movement. His voice was unchanged. That was the thing. No break in it. No roughness. No compression. Nothing a person could isolate afterward and say, there, that was the moment the man became something else. But Rowan had served under him long enough to hear the difference anyway. Not in tone. In finality. Yes, sir, Rowan said. He moved immediately. Outside the office, the command corridor had begun waking in layers. Night shift personnel straightening as word moved faster than policy. The diplomatic liaison station flashing with incoming requests. One analyst at the far terminal standing halfway out of his chair because he had seen the Keth feed and did not yet know whether to enter or disappear. Rowan cut through them all and pulled the requested data himself. Territorial movement. Fuel line expansion. Corridor installations. Supply node growth. Cargo throughput increase. Military escort patterns attached to nominally civilian infrastructure. The last 90 days became maps. Then tables. Then overlays. Then one thick packet because Marcus trusted screens and distrusted them equally, and paper remained the fastest way to spread structure across a room. By the time Rowan returned, the first direct call had arrived. Not to Marcus. To command reception. Then redirected. Then held. The Secretary General's office. Marcus did not acknowledge it. He stood at the display wall, the original 3 maps gone now, replaced by Dominion movement layers expanding in pale geometric lines across the dark. Rowan laid the packet on the desk. Marcus did not turn. Leave it, he said. The call indicator kept flashing. Then another joined it. Joint Chiefs. Then Diplomatic Affairs. Then 2 foreign relay requests tagged urgent. The room acquired the look of a place around which institutions had begun forming a circle. Marcus studied the wall. Rows of installations. Transit hubs. Refuel depots. Maintenance stations. Civilian processing corridors with military dependencies nested beneath them so neatly they could be defended, if challenged, as simple efficiencies of shared infrastructure. He said without taking his eyes off the map, "Cue all calls." No response yet. Yes, sir. Rowan hesitated. Only for a moment. Only because, in 5 years, he had learned when Marcus expected questions and when questions were simply the sound of other people lagging behind. This was not a question moment. He went back to the outer office. The first hour passed like that. Calls arriving. Requests escalating. Attachments multiplying. The Keth public broadcast copied into secured archives and translated, then retransmitted to every level of government required to have officially seen it. News channels across 3 orbital jurisdictions beginning to speak in the brittle, over-articulated language institutions used when they had not yet chosen whether to name something murder, provocation, or tragedy. At 0418 local command time, the Secretary General herself came through the line. Rowan stood before the lit terminal and listened to her aide bypass 2 levels of protocol in a voice sharpened by the kind of panic only proximity to power could produce. The Secretary General requires. General Vale is reviewing operational data, Rowan said. This is not optional. Rowan looked through the open office door. Marcus had not moved. The same posture. The same angle of head. The same impossible stillness before the wall of stars and infrastructure grids and contested routes. It occurred to Rowan then, with the cold clarity of a fact that would later feel obvious, that Marcus was not delaying response because he was overwhelmed. He was delaying because he had already entered the problem. And once Marcus entered a problem fully, interruption became not merely irritating but conceptually irrelevant. General Vale will respond when response is useful, Rowan said. He ended the connection before the aide could answer. The second hour brought witnesses. Not physical witnesses. Data witnesses. Secondary feeds. Cross-angled captures. An intelligence package from one of the Keth-adjacent relays confirming that the convocation chamber's public broadcast array had been active the entire time. Another packet identifying partial audio mismatch in the final 32 seconds. Proof that some procedural layers had continued functioning during the event, translating maintenance notices and weather updates into the public stream. Rowan read that line twice. A weather update. In the middle of it. The fact lodged somewhere low and unpleasant inside him. At 0527 he printed that packet too and carried it in. Marcus took this one directly from his hand. Read the page once. Then again more slowly. His thumb remained at the lower corner of the sheet after he finished, holding it with such light pressure it should not have left any mark at all. What, Marcus said, is the nearest complete list of Dominion Corridor logistics installations? Rowan answered immediately. Outer Systems Intelligence Archive, sir. Possibly incomplete by 48 hours. Marcus set down the page. Get it? Rowan turned to go. Rowan. He stopped. Marcus was still looking at the wall. Not at him. Not at the paper. At the map. The public channel, Marcus said. The one they used. Yes, sir? Bring me the full technical specifications. Rowan stood silent for 1 second. Then, yes, sir. He left. By 0630, command staff had begun arriving in person, many of them still in transit uniforms or civilian coats thrown over half-fastened formal wear. Faces drawn. Speech clipped. No one wanted to be the first to ask the wrong question in the wrong room. They entered the outer office, saw Rowan's expression, saw the stack of calls still unanswered, saw the flood of printed material, and understood enough to lower their voices without being told. One by one they looked through the open door. One by one they saw Marcus at the wall display. And one by one the same instinctive response crossed them, not pity. Not even sympathy in its first form. Something closer to professional dread. The recognition that whatever happened next would not be disorder. It would be design. At 0710, Admiral Soren arrived. At 0718, General Park. At 0726, Director Hale from Diplomatic Affairs, eyes red-rimmed and jaw set hard enough to imply she had spent the journey to Titan Station trying not to become the first civilian official to lose composure in front of Marcus Vale. Rowan intercepted all three. General Vale is not taking meetings yet. Admiral Soren stared at him. Not taking. He is reviewing. Park, who knew Marcus better than either of the others, did not argue. He simply looked through the door and said very quietly, "How long?" Rowan answered with the only honest thing available. "I don't think he's measuring it that way." Park's expression tightened by almost nothing. He nodded once. Then all three waited in the outer office while the calls continued to stack and the station day began in earnest beyond the sealed command floor. Inside, Marcus finally moved. Not abruptly. He stepped away from the wall. Crossed to the desk. Opened the packet Rowan had brought 22 minutes earlier. Spread 3 sheets side by side. Territorial movement. Fuel dependencies. Corridor expansion vectors. He looked at them for a long time. Then he reached, almost absently, for the coffee mug near the corner of the desk. Rowan had not noticed it before. Old ceramic. Dark glaze. Half full. Cold long past drinking temperature. Marcus lifted it, turned it once in his hand and set it back down. The gesture did not read as grief. It read as contact with an object that had survived across the boundary between before and after. He said, "Get them in here." Rowan did not ask who. He opened the door wider. Admiral Soren, General Park and Director Hale entered. Marcus remained standing. He did not greet them. He did not offer seating. He pointed once to the wall display, where the Keth corridor network glowed in cold lines across the dark. "This," he said, "is not a retaliation problem." No one spoke. Marcus picked up the page containing the technical specifications of the Keth public broadcast band. Set it beside the installation map. Then he looked at the three of them in turn, and when he did Rowan understood, with a certainty too complete to be comforting, that the real meeting had only now begun. "This," Marcus said, "is a translation problem." He turned back to the wall. "Sit down." And for the first time since the notification had arrived, the room obeyed not grief, not shock, not policy,
but the opening movement of a plan.